A joke could get you killed in medieval Europe, yet a special class of performers made mockery of the crown their dangerous profession. These jesters, minstrels, and mummers were the daring souls who hid behind painted masks and clever rhymes, risking everything to entertain and speak truth to power. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these artists used laughter as a weapon and turned their performances into acts of rebellion. How did they craft jokes that criticized a king without losing their heads? And what secret codes protected them from the executioner's blade? What would you risk for the freedom to speak your mind? A lone jester's bell echoed across the mud and wattle huts of a medieval village, a sound that promised a temporary reprieve from the relentless grind of peasant life. These traveling performers were far more than simple amusement. They were a vital thread in the social fabric. Emerging from a world with no newspapers or public forums, they became the living heartbeat of communal information and shared experience. In an age where your station in life was fixed from birth, their arrival signaled a brief, glorious suspension of the rules. They carried with them the latest ballads from distant courts, satirical plays mocking the local lord, and fantastical tales of dragons and heroes. For an afternoon, the strict hierarchies enforced by crown and church would soften, as laughter united the blacksmith, the farmer, and the merchant in the town square. This unique position gave them an incredible, almost sacred power. They could shape public opinion, spread gossip as fact, and voice the quiet grievances of the people under the thin veil of a joke. They were the unofficial chroniclers of their time, delivering the news not with a dry report, but with a song, a puppet show, or a clever rhyme. This made them indispensable to the common folk, who had no other outlet for discourse, and deeply suspicious to the authorities, who understood the dangerous potential of a crowd united by laughter. How did these roving artists navigate the treacherous path between being celebrated entertainers and being arrested as rabble-rousers? Their survival depended on a masterful understanding of their audience, from the poorest peasant to the most powerful king. That cap and bells were a uniform of calculated absurdity, a disguise that granted a unique form of diplomatic immunity. Within the echoing stone halls of a castle, the jester operated under a sacred, unwritten rule, the license to mock. This was not merely about telling a good joke. It was a sophisticated psychological contract between the ruler and the ruled. The king, isolated by his own power, needed someone who could reflect a distorted version of reality back to him, a truth he would never accept from a stern-faced advisor. The jester's humor was the spoonful of sugar that helped the bitter medicine of criticism go down. He could point out the king's greed by pretending to hoard the dinner rolls, or highlight a foolish military campaign through a ridiculous puppet show. His antics were a pressure valve, releasing the tension that built up in a court governed by strict protocol and suffocating deference. His safety, however, was a fragile thing, balanced on a razor's edge. A joke that landed perfectly could earn him a gold coin and the grateful laughter of the court, but the same joke, delivered on the wrong day to a monarch in a foul temper, could see him whipped or thrown into the dungeons. His survival depended on an intimate understanding of human nature, reading the room with the precision of a master strategist. He was part comedian, part therapist, and part spy, all while maintaining the illusion of being just a harmless fool. How did these men and women come to hold such a strange and dangerous office, and what kind of person would willingly step into such a volatile role? While the jester performed his delicate dance in the royal court, another voice carried dissent along the muddy roads between towns. It was the voice of the minstrel, a traveling poet whose lute was as sharp a weapon as any jester's wit. These wandering musicians were the news broadcasters and social commentators of their era, their ballads and poems the only source of information and entertainment for many isolated communities. A minstrel might arrive in a village square and begin a song that appeared on its surface to be a rousing tale of a noble knight's glorious victory. But for those listening closely, the verses held a secret layer of meaning. A line praising a lord's vast landholdings might cleverly hint at the families he displaced to acquire them. A chorus about his generosity could subtly underscore his notorious stinginess. This was subversion set to music, a dangerous game played with allegory and double meaning. Their safety lay in their mobility and their ambiguity. Unlike a court jester tied to one master, a minstrel could sing a satirical song in one town and be miles away before the local lord even heard about it. Their performances in crowded taverns and bustling markets gave them a direct line to the common people, making them incredibly effective at shaping public sentiment. They could turn a king's unpopular tax into a mocking rhyme that would be sung for years, eroding his authority one verse at a time. This power did not go unnoticed. Authorities often kept a close watch on these musical travelers, aware that a catchy tune could spread rebellion faster than any printed pamphlet. How did these singers craft lyrics that were innocent to the powerful but incendiary to the powerless? And what happened when their clever disguises failed? But the most dangerous mockery often unfolded not in royal courts or tavern songs, but in the open air of the village green. Here, a different kind of performer took center stage, the mummer. During a harvest festival or a Christmas celebration, the familiar order of the world would turn upside down. Anonymous figures, cloaked in ragged costumes and wearing grotesque wooden masks, would erupt into a chaotic performance. Their very name came from mumming, the act of masking and disguising the self, and this anonymity was their ultimate shield. In one such play, a character representing a local baron might strut about, announcing a ridiculous new tax on sunlight or laughter, while another mummer, playing a simple peasant, would outwit him with absurd logic and slapstick humor. These folk dramas were raw, loud, and deeply subversive. Without saying a word or speaking in distorted, guttural voices, they lampooned the very people who held power over their daily lives. A corrupt tax collector could be portrayed as a bumbling fool, a greedy clergyman as a gluttonous pig. For the audience of villagers, this was more than just entertainment. It was a form of community catharsis. It was the one safe moment where the powerless could laugh directly at the powerful, releasing generations of pent-up frustration without a single person being identified and punished. The performance itself was the rebellion. By transforming their shared grievances into a public spectacle, they strengthened the social bonds between neighbors and quietly, persistently, challenged the idea that their betters were inherently superior. This masked mayhem was a vital pressure valve, but what happened when the crown decided the laughter had gone too far, and the thin veil of disguise was no longer enough to protect them? That thin veil of disguise relied on a shared secret language between the performer and the crowd. This language was built on allegory and symbolism, the lifeblood of their dangerous craft. A traveling storyteller would not directly accuse the king of greed. Instead, he would spin a fable about a proud lion who hoarded all the food in the forest, leaving the other animals to starve. The entire audience, from the lowest farmer to the wealthiest merchant, would understand the true meaning instantly, sharing a knowing glance and a muffled laugh. This was how they embedded their sharpest criticisms within the safe shells of animal tales, biblical parables, and ancient myths. The story itself became a shield, providing plausible deniability if a sheriff's man was listening. A play about a greedy dragon terrorizing a village might be a thinly veiled representation of a tax-collecting baron, its fiery breath symbolizing his relentless financial demands. A minstrel's ballad about a foolish shepherd who lost his entire flock could be a masterful critique of an incompetent bishop leading his congregation astray. This coded communication required a certain intelligence and cultural knowledge to decipher, turning the performance into an interactive puzzle. The crowd's collective understanding, their shared recognition of the hidden message, was the true performance. This sophisticated use of metaphor transformed simple entertainment into a covert public dialogue about power, justice, and morality. It demonstrated a breathtaking level of creativity, a necessary invention for speaking truth in a time when direct speech could mean death. How did the authorities respond to this flood of coded criticism, and what happened when the powerful finally cracked the code? A leather mask pressed against the skin was the performer's first line of defense. This was not merely a costume piece but a deliberate act of erasure, a strategic disappearance into a character who could say and do the unthinkable. By adopting a false name and a grotesque visage, the entertainer created a crucial legal and social distance between their personal identity and their satirical act. The critique now came from Lord Foolish or Dame Gossip, fictional entities that could be banished from a town with no lasting consequence to the human beneath the disguise. This separation transformed dangerous personal mockery into a form of ritualized rebellion, a sanctioned space where society's tensions could be acted out and temporarily resolved. The mask itself was often thought to hold a kind of magic, a spiritual power that protected the wearer from the worldly anger of the lord or bishop they were lampooning. It was a shield woven from belief and craft, allowing a performer to stand before a crowd and, with a distorted voice, articulate the very grievances shared by every person watching. In a world with no right to free speech, this anonymity was the closest one could get to a license for dissent. It empowered the voiceless to speak, if only through a carved wooden face, turning every masked performance into a daring experiment in collective courage. What happened then when the authorities grew tired of this game and decided to unmask the rebellion? A candlelit castle hall presented a stage of terrifying precision. Here, every word was a potential trap, and the jester's mockery had to be as finely honed as a knight's sword. His humor was often intellectual, woven from clever wordplay and witty observations that the educated courtiers could appreciate. He might use a chessboard to demonstrate the foolishness of a rival king's military strategy, his movements both a game and a devastating critique. The laughter in this room was measured, a chorus of nervous titters and genuine amusement mixed with the constant, unspoken fear of the monarch's reaction. One misstep, one joke that cut a little too close to the bone, and the mood could shift from celebratory to deadly in an instant. The performer in this gilded cage had to be a master psychologist, reading the subtle shifts in the king's expression, understanding the complex web of alliances and enmities in the room. His survival depended on his ability to make the king laugh at himself without ever feeling truly diminished. It was a dance on a knife's edge where the reward was patronage and protection, but the penalty was imprisonment or worse. This high-stakes environment demanded a specific kind of courage, one masked not by a physical disguise but by a facade of foolishness. How different this was from the freedom of the village square. Out in the open air, surrounded by the earthy smells of livestock and fresh bread, the performer's art transformed. Here, the comedy was broad, physical, and loud. A mummer might put on a grotesque mask and pretend to be the local sheriff, tripping over his own feet and being pelted with rotten vegetables by a delighted crowd. The satire was less veiled, the allegories more obvious, and the laughter was a roaring, communal release. In these spaces, the performer was not an official part of a delicate hierarchy, but an outside force, a temporary invader who gave voice to the crowd's deepest frustrations. The risks were different, too. While a king might order a specific punishment, a mob could turn unpredictable, and a local bailiff, less concerned with courtly nuance, might simply have a performer beaten and run out of town for causing a disturbance. Yet, this very unpredictability also offered a strange kind of protection. In the anonymous press of the crowd, a performer could vanish, their identity swallowed up by the very people they entertained. They moved constantly, carrying the whispered grievances of one town to the next, their performances acting as a network of dissent that connected the entire countryside. This constant journey from the refined court to the raucous crossroads made them the most informed and adaptable people in the medieval world. They were the only ones who could truly see the whole picture, understanding the fears of the peasant and the vanities of the prince. What happened when these two worlds collided, when a joke born in a muddy field finally reached the ears of the man on the throne? A single copper coin tossed into a performer's hat represented more than just payment. It was a quiet vote of confidence. The financial engine that kept these satirists on the road was a delicate dance between two very different audiences. In the village square, the reward was immediate and tangible, a handful of coins, a loaf of bread, or a place to sleep, given freely by a crowd that saw their own struggles reflected in the performance. This popular support was the bedrock of their existence, a direct transaction of laughter for livelihood. Yet, to truly thrive, many performers needed a more substantial patron. A wealthy baron or bishop might secretly commission a biting ballad that mocked a rival lord, finding it far more effective than a formal letter of complaint. The performer became a hired wit, a musical mercenary in a silent war of influence. Some of the most powerful rulers even kept a court fool on a formal salary, not despite their critiques, but because of them. They understood that a jester's barbed joke about a new tax could reveal the public's mood more accurately than any spy's report. This created a precarious economic tightrope. A performer had to maintain their credibility with the common folk, who were the source of their material and their grassroots support, while also pleasing a powerful patron who expected their loyalty. A minstrel who became too closely associated with a single noble family might find his songs met with silence in the next town, his connection to the people's pulse severed. The business of mockery demanded not just artistic courage, but also sharp financial acumen. They had to be negotiators and diplomats, understanding that a joke could pay their wages, but the wrong joke could bankrupt their future. How did this constant negotiation shape the very content of their performances? And what happened when the demands of the patron directly contradicted the will of the people? The air in the throne room could grow cold in an instant. A jester testing a new joke about the king's foreign policy would watch the monarch's eyes, a master of reading the subtlest shift from amusement to icy displeasure. This was the razor's edge of tolerated mockery, a legal gray area where the rules were never written down and changed with the ruler's mood. Performers existed in a precarious space, shielded by tradition, but never truly safe from the law's long arm. Unwritten codes dictated the subjects they could touch. A joke about the king's new tax might be permitted, even welcomed as a form of feedback, but a personal attack on his queen or a direct challenge to his God-given right to rule was often a step too far, a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. The legal status of these artists was a patchwork across Europe. In some courts, a formal concept known as the fool's privilege offered a recognized, though limited, immunity. In other places, a performer had no official standing at all. their safety depending entirely on the crowd's favor or a lord's fleeting good humor. The consequences for overstepping were as varied as they were severe. A minor offense might lead to temporary banishment from the town or a night in the stocks. A more serious transgression, however, could mean imprisonment in a damp dungeon, physical mutilation like the loss of an ear or a hand, or, in the most extreme cases, public execution. This constant threat demanded that performers become brilliant political analysts. They had to sense the tensions simmering beneath the surface of court life, understand the current alliances and rivalries, and know when a formerly safe topic had suddenly become forbidden. Their survival was a daily lesson in the fragile social contract between power and parody, a high-stakes game where the prize was laughter, but the penalty was everything. The laughter in King Henry I's court could die in a heartbeat. One man who knew this terrifying shift better than most was the jester Raher. A favored entertainer of the king, Raher's wit was as sharp as a courtier's dagger. According to the lore that has survived for centuries, he once crafted a performance that went beyond the usual gentle ribbing. His satire cut so deep that it provoked the king's absolute fury. Fearing for his life, Raher fled the court, supposedly falling gravely ill during his escape. In his sickness, he experienced a powerful vision that led him to renounce his old life of mockery and found the great priory of St. Bartholomew in London, which later became the famous St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Whether this story is entirely true or a legend woven around a real historical figure, it captures a universal truth for these performers. A single misstep could transform a life of laughter into a desperate fight for survival, a journey from the court's warmth to the harshness of the road. Not every story ended with such a dramatic redemption. The historical record shows other performers who simply vanished after a daring act. Consider the minstrel who openly mocked King Edward II's controversial relationship with his favorite, Piers Gaveston. This performer, whose name is lost to us, sang a ballad that crossed from clever allegory into direct and dangerous criticism. After that performance, he disappears from all official documents. We are left to wonder if he was quietly imprisoned, forced into exile, or suffered a worse fate. His story is a stark reminder that for every jester who became a legend, there were countless others whose courage led them into obscurity or an unmarked grave. Yet some did manage to walk the razor's edge and live to tell the tale. Their survival often depended on a perfect combination of quick wit, royal clemency, and sheer luck. A performer who made a king laugh even in the midst of his own anger might be pardoned, his transgression forgiven but never forgotten. These narrow escapes themselves became part of the performer's act, a new layer of legend that proved their audacity and skill. The tale of Raher's transformation, whether fact or fable, and the silent disappearance of the minstrel who mocked a king, together illuminate the immense personal risks behind the merriment. These were not just entertainers, they were gamblers whose wager was their own life, betting that their next joke would bring applause from the throne rather than the cold command of the executioner. Her voice was a carefully practiced baritone, a tool of disguise as vital as the padded doublet and the false beard. This rare female performer, hidden within a male persona, moved with an exaggerated swagger across the village stage, her every gesture a calculated performance within a performance. While the chronicles are filled with the names of men, women also walked the dangerous path of the satirical entertainer, navigating a world that offered them even fewer protections. Some traveled within the safety of a family troupe, learning the craft from fathers or husbands. Others, far more daring, operated on their own, using the stage as one of the only platforms available to critique the very patriarchal system that confined them. Their humor often targeted the domestic sphere, the seat of power they knew intimately. A skit might lampoon a tyrannical husband who demanded absolute obedience while being utterly helpless to mend his own hose. A ballad could tell the story of a young woman forced into a marriage with a wealthy but foolish old man, her clever verses highlighting the absurdity of treating women as property. They took aim at the grand ideals of courtly love, exposing the hypocrisy of knights who pledged eternal devotion in poetry while showing casual disregard for the women in their own households. For a female performer, every joke was a double-edged sword. Her critique of a lord's greed could be dangerous enough, but her mockery of gender norms struck at the very foundations of the social order. She had to be a master of subtlety, weaving her rebellion into domestic comedies and love songs so that her most radical points could be dismissed as harmless entertainment if challenged. Her very presence on stage was an act of defiance, a rejection of the passive, silent role assigned to her. These women expanded the territory of dissent, using laughter to challenge not only the crown but the entire structure of a society that kept them in their place. Their stories, though often lost to the official record, remind us that the desire to speak truth to power knows no gender, and that the mask could liberate a woman's voice in a world determined to keep it quiet. A wooden cross dangled askew from the neck of a performer, his movements a clumsy parody of solemn grace. In the open space before a village church, a mummer playing a corrupt priest would announce a new tax on repentance, his pockets already bulging with fake coins from the crowd. This was religious satire, a direct and dangerous challenge to the most powerful institution in medieval Europe. The church, with its vast landholdings and political ambitions, presented a glaring target. Performers gave physical form to the quiet grumbling heard in every alehouse and market, crafting characters that mirrored the very real abuses of a greedy bishop or a lazy parish priest. They staged mock sermons where the holy words were twisted into excuses for collecting more money, or comic rituals where the sacraments were performed with ridiculous props. For an audience living under the dual burden of tithes and spiritual expectation, this humor was a release of immense social pressure. It was one thing to be told your poverty was a virtue, and another to watch a gluttonous monk on stage, his belly shaking with laughter as he devoured a chicken meant to symbolize a sinner's soul. The performers were channeling a deep, popular discontent that had no other outlet, turning complex theological grievances into simple, powerful images everyone could understand. This mockery walked the finest of lines. To criticize a clergyman was one matter, but to satirize the church itself could be seen as heresy, a crime punishable by excommunication or even burning at the stake. Yet the sheer persistence of this satire proves it was answering a profound social need. By publicly exaggerating the gap between the church's pious ideals and the all-too-human failings of its representatives, these traveling entertainers were holding the powerful clergy accountable in the only court available to common people, the court of public opinion. Their laughter affirmed that no institution, not even one claiming divine authority, was beyond the reach of critical humor. How did the church respond to this relentless mockery from the muddy grounds of the village green? The cathedral itself seemed to breathe a different air during the Feast of Fools. A young choir boy, his voice barely broken, would be draped in oversized vestments and ceremoniously led to the bishop's own seat, proclaimed the Lord of Misrule for a single, glorious day. This was not a spontaneous act of rebellion but a deeply embedded tradition, a seasonal pressure valve built into the very rhythm of medieval life. Across Europe, the calendar was punctuated by these sanctioned explosions of chaos. The raucous celebrations of Carnival before the solemnity of Lent, the topsy-turvy revelry of Twelfth Night, and countless local feasts all shared a common purpose: the temporary inversion of the entire social order. For a few brief days, the world was deliberately turned upside down. The poor could pretend to be kings, the commoners could mock their lords, and the sacred rituals of the church were playfully, and sometimes pointedly, parodied. This was the one time when the rigid hierarchies that governed every other day of the year were not just softened, but actively and joyfully overturned. And at the very heart of this ritualized madness were the traveling performers. They were the masters of ceremony for this temporary anarchy, the ones who knew the old scripts for mocking the powerful and could lead a crowd in the cathartic release of generations of pent-up frustration. They would orchestrate processions where a beggar was carried through the streets on a throne, issuing absurd decrees that everyone was required to feast or be lazy. They staged plays where the sheriff was the fool and the peasant was the wise judge. This licensed rebellion was a brilliant, if risky, social compromise. The authorities, from the local baron to the bishop, understood that allowing this controlled outburst of criticism during a specific festival could prevent a much more dangerous, genuine uprising later. It gave the common people a taste of power, a chance to see their rulers rendered ridiculous, and then, when the festival ended, life returned to normal. The crown itself was not immune to this ritual mockery. A king of misrule would be elected, often a commoner or a performer, who would issue silly proclamations, parodying the king's own speeches and ceremonies. He might declare a tax on seriousness or command that all nobles must serve their servants for the day. For the duration of the festival, this mock king held a strange, symbolic power. His antics were a reminder that the crown was, after all, just a piece of metal worn by a man, and that the entire structure of society was, in many ways, a performance. These seasonal traditions reveal a profound truth about medieval society. They did not seek to destroy authority, but rather to question it within a safe and temporary container. By institutionalizing critique through performance, they created a world where laughter could ask the most dangerous questions, as long as it was confined to its proper place on the calendar. What happened, though, when the laughter did not stop when the festival ended, and the spirit of mockery began to seep into everyday life? The contents of a performer's wagon amounted to a portable rebellion kit. Each carefully chosen prop was a tool for communication and a shield against retribution. Among the most common were exaggerated phallic symbols and oversized codpieces, items that seem crude to modern eyes but served a precise satirical purpose. In a society obsessed with lineage and patriarchal power, these props mocked the aristocratic obsession with virility and bloodlines. A performer wearing a ludicrously large codpiece would strut like a nobleman, his physical posturing rendered absurd, making the audience question the very foundations of masculine authority. Similarly, ragged costumes, often made from discarded flour sacks and patched with colorful scraps, created a stark visual contrast to the silks and furs of the nobility. This was a sartorial joke on the entire class system, highlighting the vast gulf between the reality of peasant life and the opulent displays of the court. Animal masks were another essential tool, transforming the performer into a walking allegory. A sly fox mask instantly signaled a cunning lawyer or a deceitful tax collector. A greedy pig's face could represent a gluttonous abbot hoarding church wealth. These masks allowed for immediate, non-verbal characterization that everyone in the audience, regardless of literacy, could understand. They created a symbolic layer between the performer's identity and the target of the joke, making the critique about a type of person rather than a specific individual, which provided crucial legal deniability. The mask was both a disguise and a declaration, a way to say the unsayable through a carved wooden face. Musical instruments, too, were weapons of satire. A simple pipe and tabor or a well-worn lute could be played with a deliberate clumsiness or a jarring rhythm to undermine the solemnity of a royal procession or a church hymn. A minstrel might play a familiar, dignified melody associated with a particular lord, but then twist the tune into a raucous, mocking version, the musical equivalent of a sly wink to the crowd. This sonic subversion was a powerful way to critique without a single word, using the language of music itself to convey disrespect and ridicule. But perhaps the most daring tool was the puppet. A marionette controlled by strings offered the ultimate layer of protection. A puppet of a king could be made to dance foolishly, fall on its face, or even lose its head, all while the puppeteer stood safely to the side, his hands hidden. The agency for this dangerous political commentary was transferred entirely to an inanimate object. The performer could merely claim to be the humble operator, while the puppet was the one uttering the treasonous lines. This clever division allowed for some of the most direct and dangerous critiques of all, delivered from the safety of a wooden mouth. The craftsmanship behind these puppets, these masks, and these costumes reveals a sophisticated comic art form, one where every stitch and carving was imbued with intention. These performers were not just random jesters, they were master satirists who used their entire arsenal to walk the razor's edge between laughter and punishment. That shared glance in the crowd was a silent pact. When a performer sang a line about a fox in the henhouse, and a wave of knowing laughter rippled through the audience, something more than entertainment was happening. This was the core mechanism of their dangerous craft, a collaborative relationship where the audience became active co-conspirators. The performer provided the coded message, the allegory, or the symbolic puppet, but it was the crowd's collective recognition that gave it life and power. Their laughter was the final, crucial ingredient, transforming a simple story into a bold political statement. This shared comprehension created an instant bond of solidarity among everyone present. In that moment, the blacksmith, the baker, and the farmer were united not just by amusement, but by a common understanding of the injustices they faced. They were all in on the secret, participants in a silent rebellion where their very merriment was an act of defiance. This collective participation offered a layer of protection. If a sheriff's officer questioned the performance, the villagers could honestly claim it was just a funny tale about a fox. The sedition did not reside in the words themselves, but in the space between the performer's delivery and the audience's interpretation. This made every public gathering a potential hotbed for dissent, where dangerous ideas could spread like wildfire without a single treasonous declaration being made. The authorities understood this dynamic all too well. They feared the unifying power of that shared laughter more than they feared any individual performer. It revealed that resistance to power is not always a matter of direct confrontation. Often, it flourishes in the hidden language of culture, in the jokes, songs, and stories that allow a community to affirm its grievances and strengthen its bonds right under the nose of those in charge. How did this delicate, unspoken alliance between artist and audience shape the very nature of protest in an age of absolute authority? A king's decision to laugh at his own caricature was rarely just good humor. It was a calculated political strategy. Why would a monarch who held the power of life and death permit a lowly jester to mock his policies or his person? The answer lies in a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and statecraft. These rulers instinctively recognized that a grumble channeled into laughter was far less dangerous than a grumble that festered into a shout. By allowing a performer to act out the people's grievances in a castle hall, the crown effectively contained and neutralized that discontent. It became a managed spectacle, a safety valve releasing steam that might otherwise explode into genuine rebellion. This controlled mockery gave the monarch something invaluable, a raw, unfiltered gauge of public opinion. In an era before polls or press, the crowd's reaction to a jester's joke about a new tax was the most reliable feedback a king could get. He could see which of his policies caused nervous laughter and which provoked roaring approval, all without ever having to ask a direct question. There was also a powerful element of image cultivation at play. A ruler who could smile through a satirical barb projected an aura of unshakable confidence. He demonstrated that his power was so secure it could not be threatened by a fool's words. In contrast, a king who flew into a rage at every joke betrayed a deep-seated insecurity, revealing the very weakness the performer had hinted at. This created a bizarre dependency. The monarch was surrounded by courtiers who told him only what he wanted to hear, but the jester, protected by his cap and bells, could voice uncomfortable truth. He was the one person in the court who could say, "Your plan is foolish," or "The people are suffering," without immediately losing his head. This unique channel for honest counsel, disguised as entertainment, provided a vital check on the ruler's isolation. The relationship was a complex dance of power and parody, where the crown strategically incorporated criticism into its own governance. The court jester was not merely a fool. He was a primitive form of both political advisor and public relations manager, his jokes a tool to maintain the stability of the very throne he mocked. How far could this strategic tolerance stretch before the laughter truly began to undermine the crown's authority? A wooden mask carved in Kyoto could speak the same dangerous truths as one shaped from English oak. While jesters and minstrels navigated the courts and villages of Europe, remarkably similar figures were emerging across the medieval world, each using laughter as a subtle blade against authority. In Japan, Zenji Buddhist comedians performed kyogen, or wild words, during the solemn no-theater interludes. These actors, through exaggerated sketches of bumbling lords and cunning servants, exposed the frailties of the samurai class, all while operating under the protective umbrella of temple and shogunate patronage. Their comedy was a formalized critique, a way to question social hierarchies without directly challenging them. Far to the west, in the empires of Mali and Songhai, the griot held a position of immense power. More than a mere storyteller, the griot was a living historian, genealogist, and advisor. Woven into their epic poems and songs of praise were sharp observations and veiled warnings for the rulers they served. A griot could remind a Mansa of his ancestors' humble beginnings or critique a failed military campaign through a metaphorical tale, his words carrying weight precisely because of his respected official role. In the bustling marketplaces of the Islamic world, another form of masked satire thrived. The Karagöz shadow puppet theater, popular across the Ottoman Empire, used leather puppets to cast silhouettes of political commentary onto a lit screen. Behind this screen, the puppeteer could safely voice the grievances of the common people, his puppets mocking corrupt officials and pompous clerics in a riotous play of light and shadow. Even in the intricate court cultures of India, the Vidashak or court jester was a familiar presence, often a Brahmin who spoke in Sanskrit. His apparent foolishness and physical comedy gave him the license to speak uncomfortable truths to the king, critiquing policy and personality from within the inner circle of power. What does this global tapestry of critical performers reveal? It shows us that the human desire to question power through performance is not a European invention but a fundamental impulse. From the griots of West Africa to the Vidashaks of India, societies worldwide developed their own containers for dissent, their own versions of the cap and bells. The specific forms varied, shaped by local religion, politics, and social structure. A griot's critique was embedded in historical authority, while a Karagöz puppeteer's barbs were hidden behind anonymity. Yet they all served the same essential purpose: providing a channel for criticism in societies where direct opposition was impossible or fatal. This wider view helps us see the European jester not as a unique anomaly, but as one vibrant thread in a much larger, global story of how humanity has always used art to speak truth to power. The bold lines of a modern political cartoon depicting a world leader as a bloated king or a bumbling clown carry an ancient echo. This visual shorthand for critique was perfected not in a newspaper office, but on the muddy village greens of the medieval world. The techniques honed by those traveling performers, their survival depending on allegory and caricature, did not vanish with the arrival of the printing press. Instead, they simply found new mediums. The woodcut illustrations in Renaissance pamphlets took the mummer's masked mockery and translated it into printed form, allowing satirical images to travel farther and faster than any troupe of actors ever could. The witty, subversive banter of the court jester was refined and put into the mouths of Shakespeare's fools, characters like the clever touchstone or the hauntingly wise fool in King Lear, who use their licensed nonsense to speak painful truths that the noble characters cannot utter. This lineage flows directly into the coffeehouses of the 18th century, where writers like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope wielded savage irony as their weapon, penning essays that proposed eating Irish children as a solution to famine, a grotesque exaggeration that held a mirror to British policy with the same brutal force as a mummer's play. The core tools remained identical: disguise the critique in a layer of absurdity so that the audience must actively decipher the real meaning, creating that same conspiratorial bond between creator and consumer. The invention of newspapers and magazines created a permanent home for this tradition, with artists and writers producing daily or weekly satires that held the powerful accountable. In the 20th century, the court jester found his new throne on the television screen. The late-night talk show host, with his opening monologue of jokes about political scandals and policy failures, is the direct descendant of the minstrel singing a critical ballad in the town square. He operates under a similar, modern form of fool's license, his celebrity and his role as an entertainer granting him a unique permission to mock presidents and prime ministers to their virtual faces. The animated shows that use anthropomorphic animals to dissect contemporary geopolitics are simply using the medieval technique of the animal fable, replacing the greedy lion with a corrupt wolf in a business suit. This unbroken chain, from an anonymous mummer wearing a pig mask to represent a gluttonous abbot to a digital artist creating a viral meme about a corporate scandal, proves that the fundamental human need to question authority through laughter is timeless. The medium evolves, but the mission remains stubbornly the same. By recognizing this deep historical roots, we understand that our modern satirists are not just comedians. They are the inheritors of a dangerous and vital craft, one that began with a single performer standing before a crowd, deciding that some truths are best delivered with a laugh. Every laugh from the crowd was a potential step closer to the dungeon. For the traveling performer, the choice between a perfectly crafted, truthful barb and a safer, blander version was a daily moral calculation. Their entire craft was built on speaking truth to power, yet their survival depended on not speaking that truth too clearly. This was the performer's core dilemma, a tightrope walk between artistic integrity and personal safety. A minstrel composing a new ballad about a king's wasteful spending had to decide: would he use the allegory of a squirrel hoarding nuts for a winter that never comes, or would he describe the king's new golden carriage in such specific detail that everyone knew it was paid for by a cruel new tax? The first option was clever and relatively safe. The second was far more powerful and dangerously direct. This internal conflict forced them to become masters of reading a room, their eyes constantly scanning the crowd for signs of tension or approval. The most successful satirists developed an almost intuitive sense for the invisible line they could not cross. They learned to adjust their performance in real time, softening a harsh line if they noticed a nobleman's smile falter, or embellishing a risky joke if the crowd's laughter gave them courage. Some performers, driven by a fierce commitment to their art, embraced risk as part of their identity. They believed that a joke stripped of its truthful sting was no joke at all, and they were willing to face the consequences to preserve the integrity of their message. Others, perhaps with a family to feed or a long road ahead, chose subtlety over directness. They understood that a truth whispered in a metaphor could still be heard, and that living to perform another day was its own form of victory. This perpetual balancing act between courage and caution defined their professional lives. It was not a sign of cowardice, but a necessary strategy for ensuring that the vital tradition of dissent could continue. Their legacy is not just in the jokes that survived, but in the difficult choices they made in the moment, calibrating each performance to be just truthful enough to matter, and just safe enough to allow them to reach the next town. A joke structure was its armor. The most successful satirical routines followed a careful, almost ritualistic pattern designed to deliver a sharp critique while leaving no tangible evidence of treason. A performer might begin not with an insult, but with a flood of extravagant praise for the king's wisdom or the queen's beauty. This established a tone of loyalty and disarmed suspicion. Then, with the precision of a watchmaker, he would introduce the critical element. He might tell a seemingly unrelated fable about a donkey who believed he was a warhorse, all while maintaining a posture of utter sincerity. His tone, his gestures, his slightest pause would guide the audience to understand the true subject. A subtle glance toward the throne as he described the donkey's foolish charge could be all it took to connect the allegory to the king's recent, disastrous military campaign. The routine would then snap shut with a return to flattering words, leaving the actual accusation unspoken, existing only in the shared understanding between the performer and his audience. This structure provided the essential escape clause. If a guard captain confronted him, the performer could express genuine confusion, pointing to his opening and closing statements of loyalty. He could claim the story was merely a simple folktale, and any subversive interpretation was a mistake made by the listeners, not a message sent by the artist. The real genius lay in the delivery. A single raised eyebrow could transform a line of praise into a devastating insult. A stumble at the wrong moment could suggest a hidden flaw. The performer used his entire body as an instrument of implication, speaking one truth with his voice and another with his posture. This careful craftsmanship reveals that these entertainers were not just spontaneous clowns, but master rhetoricians and political thinkers. They understood the power of implication over declaration, knowing that a truth the audience discovers for itself is far more potent and far less punishable than one stated outright. Their jokes were complex machines built for survival, where every component, from the first flattering word to the final bow, served to protect the dangerous idea at its core. That roar of laughter was a political act in itself. When a crowd of peasants collectively guffawed at a puppet of their lord taking a pratfall, they were experiencing something far more profound than simple amusement. In a world where their bodies and labor were controlled, this shared merriment offered a rare taste of psychological freedom. For the duration of the performance, the rigid social order was not just suspended, it was actively mocked, and in that collective mockery, a temporary empowerment bloomed. Each burst of laughter was a tiny rebellion of the spirit, a way to reclaim a shred of dignity in the face of constant subjugation. This emotional release was a vital pressure valve for societies buckling under the weight of their own hierarchies. The daily grind of bowing and scraping, of accepting orders without question, built up a deep well of frustration. Satirical performance gave people a safe space to drain that well, to release their pent-up anger and resentment through the catharsis of comedy, rather than letting it boil over into a hopeless physical revolt. This process subtly but persistently normalized a dangerous idea that the people in charge were not infallible demigods, but merely flawed, foolish, and often ridiculous human beings. A play showing a bishop drooling over a roast chicken while preaching abstinence chipped away at the church's aura of divine authority. A ballad about a king who could not decide which shoe to put on first made him relatable, vulnerable, and laughable. This erosion of perceived infallibility was politically significant, even if it did not lead to an immediate uprising. It preserved a space for critical thinking in a culture that demanded obedience. The laughter itself strengthened community bonds, creating an unspoken alliance among everyone present. In that crowded square, the blacksmith and the dairy maid were not just neighbors, they were co-conspirators in a silent understanding that the official version of reality was not the only one. This shared secret that the emperor had no clothes was a form of social glue as strong as any law or decree. It reminds us that in repressive environments, entertainment is never just a diversion. It is often the last refuge for dissent, a place where the human spirit practices through laughter for a freedom it has not yet won. A royal edict could not stop a joke, but it could force that joke to wear a better disguise. As the satirical power of traveling performers grew, so too did the sophistication of the state's efforts to silence them. Monarchs and bishops, realizing that laughter could erode their authority as effectively as any army, moved beyond sporadic punishments to establish systematic censorship. They created networks of spies who would blend into tavern crowds, their ears tuned for any line that crossed from entertainment into sedition. Official censors were appointed to review the scripts of plays and ballads before they could be performed, striking out any passage deemed too critical. One of the most effective tools was the licensing system. A performer now needed a formal permit, a letter of patronage from a noble, to travel and entertain legally. This transformed the entertainer from a free agent into someone whose livelihood depended on the good graces of the powerful, a powerful leash designed to encourage self-censorship. The authorities were learning to manage the narrative, understanding that controlling the performers meant controlling the public conversation. But how do you cage a laugh? The performer's response was a masterclass in creative evasion. They developed secret performance codes, a lexicon of gestures, symbols, and inside jokes known only to their fellow travelers and trusted communities. A particular flourish of a handkerchief, a specific sequence of chords on a lute, or the use of a certain colored ribbon could signal to the audience that the next segment contained a hidden message. This turned the performance into an exclusive ritual where only those in the know could fully participate, further strengthening the bond between artist and audience against the outside authorities. To combat pre-performance censorship, troops would submit one bland, approved script to the local censor, and then perform a completely different, much sharper version on stage, relying on improvisation and crowd interaction to steer the narrative. They became masters of the last-minute change, the ad-libbed line that could transform a harmless tale into a pointed critique, leaving the official censor helpless against the fluid nature of live performance. Another clever tactic was the strategic use of obscure regional dialects. A minstrel might sing a seemingly innocent love song in the common tongue, but then launch into a scathing verse in a thick, rural dialect completely incomprehensible to the educated, city-born officials sent to monitor him. The local crowd would roar with understanding while the spy stood baffled, unable to report on what he could not comprehend. This relentless cat-and-mouse game did not stifle the performing arts, it fundamentally shaped them. The constant pressure from censors pushed entertainers toward greater subtlety, wit, and artistic innovation. They had to be smarter, faster, and more creative than the officials trying to catch them. The struggle for expression forced the invention of new comedic forms, more complex allegories, and a deeper, more collaborative relationship with their audiences. This history reveals a paradoxical truth that the hammer of censorship often forges the sharpest tools of satire. A farmer tilling his field in a folk song was never just a farmer. He was a political statement disguised in dirt and sweat. The lyrics might lament a blight upon the crops, a phrase that, on its surface, spoke of ruined barley, but to the knowing ear it described a corrupt bishop's new tithe. The fox stealing chickens was not merely a pest, but the local sheriff known for his underhanded seizures of property. This was the performer's secret language, a sophisticated system of codes and symbols that turned every harvest ballad into a potential manifesto. They communicated in a rich vocabulary of agricultural metaphors. A field left fallow represented a community crushed by taxation, its fertility drained away by a distant crown. A good harvest stolen by a storm symbolized a lord who took more than his fair share. This allowed a minstrel to stand in a public square and deliver a detailed critique of economic policy, all while appearing to sing a simple, rustic tune about the weather. Animal symbolism provided an even more powerful and universal shorthand. The lion was always the king, majestic but potentially dangerous. The fox was the cunning courtier or the deceitful lawyer. Sheep were the common people, gentle and easily led, while the wolf was the oppressive noble or tax collector preying upon them. A tale about a clever rabbit outwitting a hunting dog was not a children's story. It was a lesson in how the weak could use their wits to overcome the strong. These symbols were so deeply embedded in the popular consciousness that a performer needed only to mention a specific animal for the entire audience to understand the true subject of the joke. This shared symbolic language created a parallel world of meaning, a hidden layer of discourse that operated just beneath the surface of official life. The secret communication extended beyond words. A performer's costume was a canvas of coded messages. The specific color of a ribbon, the way a hat was tilted, or the pattern of patches on a sleeve could signal to the crowd the tone of the coming performance, or even identify the performer as a trusted carrier of certain views. Musical motifs acted as auditory signals. A particular sequence of notes on a lute, repeated in ballads across different regions, might serve as a covert calling card, alerting listeners that the following verses contained a hidden message for those willing to hear it. Gestures, too, were part of this silent lexicon. A hand brushed across the forehead in a specific way could mock a lord's famous sweating fits, while a subtle tug on the ear might reference a bishop known for his greed. This intricate system of signs and symbols formed a resilient network for the circulation of forbidden knowledge. It allowed critical ideas about justice, power, and freedom to travel from village to village, carried not on parchment, but in melodies and metaphors. The authorities might control the laws and the pulpits, but they could not easily police the meaning of a folk song about a wayward lamb. This demonstrated a breathtaking capacity for creative resistance. Subjugated communities, when denied a direct voice, will always find a way to weave their dissent into the very fabric of their culture, preserving dangerous truths in the safe, plain sight of a common tune. A joke that once mocked a long-dead king could find a second life in a child's nursery rhyme. The most resilient satirical routines did not die with their creators, but instead escaped into the wilds of folk tradition, passed down from grandparent to grandchild around winter fires. Consider the tale of the greedy landlord, a stock character from countless mummer plays. The specific baron he was modeled on might be forgotten, his name lost to dusty records, but the archetype of the pompous fool who trips over his own greed remained as relevant to 18th century farmers as it was to their medieval ancestors. The original, carefully crafted political allegory designed to avoid the dungeon slowly shed its topical skin. The king became a generic tyrant, the corrupt bishop a simple, greedy priest, and the specific tax was transformed into a ridiculous demand for all the milk from a farmer's best cow. Stripped of its immediate context, the joke's core message about the absurdity of unchecked power became clearer and more universal. This was how professional satire achieved immortality, not by being preserved in a library, but by being absorbed into the very bloodstream of common culture, its critical edge blunted just enough to make it safe for endless retelling. How did a complex skit survive this journey without losing its meaning? The answer lies in its emotional truth. The laughter it provoked was not just about a clever pun. It was the recognition of a shared experience, the timeless frustration of the little person being pushed around by the powerful. That feeling never grows old. A ballad about a clever peasant girl outwitting a foolish judge might have originally commented on a specific legal injustice, but generations later, the song endured because the theme of intelligence triumphing over brute authority remained endlessly appealing. The tune might change, a few lines might be forgotten, but the story's defiant heart kept beating. These fragments of medieval mockery, surviving in our fairy tales and folk songs, are more than just historical curiosities. They are a direct line into the minds of people who left few written records, revealing a consistent undercurrent of skepticism toward their rulers. They prove that the human appetite for humor that challenges authority is not a modern invention, but a deep and enduring part of our cultural DNA. The professional performer may have planted the seed with a risky, topical joke, but it was the collective memory of the people who nurtured it, pruned it, and allowed it to bloom for centuries, long after the original crown had turned to dust. A medieval jester's allegory about a greedy lion and a modern cartoonist's depiction of a world leader as a bloated king are two sides of the very same coin. Though separated by centuries, the core strategy is identical: disguise a dangerous truth within the safe shell of entertainment. The jester used animal fables and symbolic puppets, his tools carved from wood and cloth. Today's satirist uses digital illustrations and viral memes, their tools forged from pixels and social media algorithms. Yet their mission remains stubbornly unchanged: to hold a mirror to power and let the audience see the reflection for themselves. The late-night television host, delivering a monologue of jokes about a political scandal, operates with the same license as the court jester. His role as an entertainer grants him a unique permission to mock presidents and prime ministers directly, his comedy acting as a modern pressure valve for public frustration. Political cartoonists, like the mummers of old, rely on potent symbolism. They might draw a senator as an ostrich with its head in the sand, or a corporate executive as a giant vacuum cleaner sucking up public resources. These images are the direct descendants of the medieval animal mask, instantly communicating a complex critique without a single word of explicit treason. The risks, of course, have transformed. A jester feared the dungeon or the whip, while a modern satirist might face lawsuits, online harassment, or the loss of advertising revenue. But the fundamental dynamic of a creator walking a legal and social tightrope is a direct inheritance from those traveling performers. Satirical websites and comedy news programs now function as the minstrels of the digital village square, carrying the latest critiques across the globe in seconds, setting the news to the rhythm of a punchline. This enduring connection reveals something profound about the human condition. Across time and technology, we continue to build the same kind of containers for dissent. We still understand that laughter can be a devastatingly effective vehicle for truth, and that the person who makes us laugh at the powerful is performing a vital and eternally risky public service. The cap and bells may be gone, but the fool's work is never truly finished. Their painted masks have long since crumbled into dust, their clever rhymes faded from living memory. Yet the defiant spirit of these performers echoes through the centuries, a quiet drumbeat of resistance beneath the noise of history. We have walked alongside these jesters, minstrels, and mummers, uncovering a world where a joke was a calculated risk and laughter was a revolutionary act. They transformed their stages into arenas of dissent, using allegory and absurdity to say what could not be spoken aloud. In their courage, we see the enduring human need to question authority, to carve out spaces of joy and freedom even under the weight of repression. Their legacy is not confined to history books. It lives on in the political cartoonist's pen, the late-night comedian's monologue, and the protest song that becomes an anthem. The medieval proverb holds fast, many a true word is spoken in jest. These masked rebels remind us that comedy is often the most serious business of all, a vital force that holds power accountable and gives voice to the voiceless. Let their stories inspire you to listen for the courage behind the comedy in our own time, to recognize the modern performers who continue this dangerous, essential craft. If these tales of artistic bravery resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys into history's hidden corners. We would love to hear your thoughts on these daring souls in